like to welcome everybody to this meeting of the Quality Specialist Group. This is actually joined also with the Hampshire branch and Dorset branch as well. We're delighted to have our speaker tonight, Balmatu, who's going to actually say how to identify projects before they start to fail. Now, this would be a brilliant situation to be able to deal with. At this stage, I'll pass across to Bal. Thank you.
Thanks, Margaret. Thanks everyone for joining us today. So apologies about the patch on the eye. I'm just getting over some eye surgery. Feel a bit like a pirate, but I am fine to do the talk. So let me just start off by introducing myself a little bit. So I graduated in electronic communication in 1982 and worked primarily in the defence industry for the first few years, but I've been a consultant, trainer and auditor for the last 30 odd years. I mainly do ICT type audits and including some for the automotive industry and the World Lottery Association. I also do cyber security audits, particularly on the government cyber essentials scheme. I'm a ethical hacker and also a certified pen tester. So I've been a ticket auditor since 1992, and obviously since then the scheme has moved on a lot, and we now refer to it as Ticket Plus. And I'll be talking a little bit later on about Ticket Plus. Now, what I wanted to try and talk about this evening was failed projects. And it's not a case of if a project sort of fails. Every organisation that I know at some time or other has some IT projects that don't actually go to plan, and it does eat into margins and profits and all the rework and fixing and the management attention time. It all sort of affects the profitability of a business. And it's one of the challenges for most quality managers is how do we sort of manage the projects such that we have less failure cost. Now, all of the standards, project management standards, quality standards, security standards, they all talk about learning from experience and improvement. And the traditional way of learning these things from projects is to hold post-project reviews. Now, we're going to talk about how those post-project reviews lead to lessons learned, and how we use those lessons learned to get better. Now, the traditional way, and here's some examples of what has happened on UK projects in the past. Some eye-watering sort of failure costs on some of these projects, 60 million, and obviously these are huge, but most organisations will have had this where we've got an initial cost of what we thought it was going to cost, and then a final cost which exceeds the planned cost, and the difference can be quite significant. And obviously, for the challenge is for most businesses to try and bring them in as close as possible to what we'd predicted in terms of what the expected initial cost was. Now, the traditional way of doing these project reviews is that we have a meeting. I mean, Agile calls it retrospectives. We have some sort of a meeting, a review at the end of the project. There's a team reflection. We try and understand what caused the issues. You know, did the suppliers let us down? Did we have resourcing issues? Was there technical challenges? And we understand what the issues are, and we create lists of actions to do to try and stop these things happening again, so that we're learning from the experience. And some organizations will even create databases of these lessons learned to try and make it easier for people to find lessons learned from the past and reflect on them. The way that those lessons learned then gets used varies, but typically people will update their templates based on experience. They'll identify training needs or competency requirements to avoid the pitfalls in the future. They'll identify risks so that they can add contingency into the costs to avoid maybe suppliers letting them down or something similar to that based on their experience. Now, the catch with this approach is that we've already lost the money. We've already missed the deadline. We've already got this customer dispute, so it doesn't actually help that project. You know, we're reflecting on what's happened and the damage is already done. So what if there was a way of using that data from the lessons learned and establishing a form of early warning system, something like a radar system or a sonar system that would detect something coming along, set off some sort of alarm or warning signal so that we could zoom in and sort of say, oh, we're going off track, where something's happening here that shouldn't be happening. And the sooner that warning goes off, the more time we've got to remedy it before it starts affecting the profitability or the performance of that project. So that's the challenge. And we're going to talk about, I've called it early warning system. Now, early warning systems aren't new. That they're around in all sorts of forms. And here's some examples of areas where we currently already have early warning systems. And these warning systems, they typically exhibit these sort of 4 stages. One is that you understand what it is that the data that would indicate that something's about to happen. Then we would, once we understand what the data is, we'd set up the parameters to monitor for those signals. And when those signals start sort of appearing, those warnings can be acted upon. And the way they get acted upon is that we identify who can do something about them and almost have like sort of crisis plans or action plans ready, playbooks, as it were, to act on those warnings. But we've already figured out who we need to tell, and those people are wary that if they get a certain signal, that what they have to do, and they have their pre-planned actions to do this final stage, which is the response. And by having these response plans in place and the right people communicated to activate those response plans, we're in a much better position to cope with whatever the early warning system is warning us about. So in our situation, what we'd have is a little bullet down here that sort of says a project that's going off the rails, a project that is now starting to show signs that we're not going to get the margins that we'd predicted when we put the bid in, or when we worked out the costings for this project, because something is going off the rails. And it could be a supplier's performance, it could be a technical issue that we can't resolve. It could be that we've changed the project manager several times, and you know, there's a churn of people on the project, constant churn, and it's causing performance issues. So this early warning system, how can we get that to work for in a management system, a straightforward management system that's already meeting the requirements of ISO 9001? It's got all the parameters of project management, configuration management, change management, release, transition, validation. It's got all those things built into it. How do we build in an early warning system? Now, for a project, for an early warning system, we need to sort of work out what it is that causes projects to fail. Now, this is where the lessons learned that we've been doing over the years comes in useful. because we've got a lot of data, but we haven't necessarily converted that data into information, and then that information into knowledge. So the difference between data and knowledge is that we've managed to interpret that data, understand it, and sort of do something with it. So there's a challenge there as to how do we change all this data that we're getting from the lessons learned or post-project reviews and change it into knowledge. So we need to identify things as the risks, for instance, as they go through time. Now, we need to have actionable warning messages that the managers, maybe they're a technical manager, or maybe they're a project manager, maybe they're a finance manager or a supplier manager, whoever the person is in the business that could do something about this warning signal, how do we get the message to them in time for them to do something about it before it hurts the project? And the way we do that is by producing this response plan. So these 4 points I'm going to cover as 4 steps now. How do we do these 4 steps to create an early warning system for projects? So the first step, obtain this knowledge. So we've done lots of lessons learned. Traditionally, we've collected lots of data, but we've not necessarily found it useful. And it's always looking backwards. It's always telling us what caused that last project to not perform to plan. So in order to make this comparable, and the data that we got from all these projects, we need to sort of put it into pots of similar projects. So you know, you could have an R&D project, an innovative R&D project, or you could have a transformation project, and the data would look very different because the challenges are different. So ideally, we want to sort of overlay the data from similar R&D innovative projects, and then another way of overlaying projects of similar transition projects or transformation projects or prototyping projects or implementation projects, different types of projects. So we need to sort of work out a way of how we can make this data meaningful and at the same time keep it comparable. Now, all projects will have some sort of a life cycle, and there are lots of life cycles out there, as you know. So I've just sort of put up an example here of a typical life cycle, which has the traditional waterfall life cycle phases. But all projects will have phases, even an agile project or a prototyping project. And so when we start comparing projects, as long as they've all come from an established process that is applied in a similar way to all of these projects, then the data can be comparable. So when we start looking at, so once we categorize the projects as either what type of life cycle they're using, we then need to think, well, okay, some projects are going to be more complex than others. And so in order to keep the data so that we can find it useful, we want to, one, identify the life cycle that a project has used, the type of project it was, but we also want to put down, categorize it as how complex it was. You know, was it just 5 guys for 2 months, or was it 20 guys for 2 years? Was it an innovative R&D project? Was it an implementation project? Was it transformation? And so once we identify similar projects, that's when we can start comparing the data. Now, even though similar projects will have differences, they'll have challenges in terms of different customer requirements. Some will have clear requirements, some will have very vague requirements, some will have challenging timescales, some won't have so much of a challenge in terms of their timescales. So we are allowed to tailor the projects to suit the circumstances and the complexity and the nature of the project. But what we have to do is we have to have some rules around what can be tailored and how it can be tailored, because otherwise we won't be able to compare the data. So once we've identified the categories of projects or the types of and the complexity of projects, we can then start creating established ways of working to allow that data to be comparable. Now, that might mean that all the projects have to produce a project plan, but the project plan can be different depending on the nature of the projects, but they must all have a project plan. Maybe they should all have a risk register. Maybe they all have a test readiness review before they start doing their validation. So similar aspects of the project we'd have to work out that mustn't be tailored out, as it were, because that's what's going to keep the projects comparable. Now, certain things like cost to completion, the number of change requests, the stakeholder participation, like in workshops or demonstrations, resource availability, the number of times a project manager is changed on the project. This sort of data is easily collected and it's generally available anyway. It's not an extra overhead to know this data. Most project reports will be able to capture this data and capture it at set points of a project. So I'll show you how this works in a couple of examples in a minute. But say we take stakeholder involvement as an example for an agile development. Agile only works well if the stakeholders participate and attend the demonstrations and participate in the workshops and give you feedback on what they like or what they don't like and what works and what doesn't work. If they're hands off and they don't participate in those workshops and demos, then the agile process is impacted badly because it's based on getting tweaking the requirements and being, like the name implies, agile to the customer's feedback. So if you're doing an agile project and that stakeholder doesn't really fulfill their obligations, then that would be an early warning signal. Similarly, if a waterfall project, a traditional project, if there are no change requests being raised by the customer as they see more and more of the requirements analysis coming out and the design sort of formulating or the solution being developed. If they don't raise change requests, that might be an indicator that they're saving all the problems towards the end when they'll throw their arms up in the air and say, this doesn't meet our requirements, because they didn't participate in the requirements reviews and they didn't raise change requests to tune the understanding of the developers. If we take this further now, all projects will do some sort of status reporting, and very often they'll have some sort of dashboard or scorecards that will help them do this on a regular basis, maybe monthly, maybe weekly, and they'll do special reports, maybe quarterly, to a project board. Now, what we want to do is make sure that the process is established. And if the process is established, then that means that all projects will have similarities. They'll all produce a project plan. They'll all have a risk register. They'll all maybe do a test readiness review. They'll all be using change requests. And it's that established process means that there's an established way of doing it in the business, and that's what's going to keep it comparable. Now, what we don't want to do is create an overhead. As much as possible, try and use the data that's already available in the project status reports. What we then have to do is normalize that data set, because if we're comparing a project that lasts 3 months with a project that lasts 2 years, then obviously the one that lasts 2 years is likely going to have a lot more change requests than the project that only lasts 3 months. So there's got to be some sort of way of normalizing the data by maybe the man months or the man hours or the complexity of the the solution, or maybe even the value of the project. But we need some sort of normalizing, and the data needs to be reliable in that it's got to be consistent, and the best way to do that is to, like for instance, cost of completion can't be fudged. If we're monitoring the cost of completion at the various stages of the project, then we can detect when it started to be predicted to be overspent. And a trigger could be, for instance, when the cost of completion exceeds 10% of the original cost of completion. Now, one of the things that makes this easier is if you've used process assessments to establish the processes. Now, there are some well-known processes that use ISO 15504, which is a process assessment standard. One of them is called Ticket Plus. We'll talk more about it in a minute. There's another one called CMMI. There's another one called SPICE. CMMI is used by the American Department of Defense. There's SPICE. There's one for European Space Agency, and there's another one called Automotive SPICE. But basically, they are all based on ISO 15504, which is a process assessment standard. Now, the way process assessment standards work is that there's typically 5 levels, and the third level, which is the middle one, is what they call established. In CMMI, it's called defined, and in Ticket Plus, we call it silver level. Now, the idea is that we've got a probability or the chance of the project being successful, and this sort of moves. I'll show you now, depending on what level you're at in terms of the certification. So, the level 1, for instance, in Ticket Plus, the foundation, when you get this level, you can get ISO 9001 certification. And the idea is that the probability of a project achieving this goal is varied. You could get a project that performs down here, or you could get a project that performs better than expected. But typically, the projects will be around here, whereas the goal is around here. So they're off the goal, but mostly they're within the region. Now, when you get to silver, the goal is here. It's going to cost a bit more because of a few more overheads, but the chances are the overall cost will be less than it was when you were at foundation. So the probability of you finishing here is higher because you've now got a managed process. When you get to an established process, again, we've moved more to the left, so it's costing us less, and the dispersion is less. So we've got more likely to hit our goal, and the goal itself is now less in terms of it's going to cost us less. Now, this is the basis of process assessments, in that these levels are dictated by process attributes, which I'll explain in a short bit. There are 2 more levels that I'll just explain, where the systems become predictable and optimized. And this is where you start using the data that I'm talking about now, when you start using that data for improvement. So I'll talk more about these 3 levels of foundation, bronze, and silver on the next slide. So at foundation level, and this is the level that you go when you can achieve ISO 9001 certification, is that all of the processes do what they say on the tin. They achieve the purpose that they're there for. So the project management process does project management. The configuration management process does configuration manager, validation process does validation, but there might be a lot of rework. There might be a lot of rework, but it does eventually get there. Now, as you move to bronze, there's a focus on making sure that the process is managed well and that the work products are established and maintained. So as well as achieving the purpose.
I can't hear anything.
Oh, can you not hear me? Oh, can anyone else?
I can hear you.
Okay,
No,
right.
no, it's fine.
Okay.
You can hear you.
Right.
Yeah, thanks, me too.
Sorry, yeah. So at bronze, what we're doing is we're managing the process and we're also managing the work products as well as achieving the purpose. So at bronze, we're more likely to achieve the goals. And then when we go into silver, we're achieving the purpose, we're managing the process, so we're managing the work products, but now we're also doing it in an established way in that all of the projects are doing it in the same way. They're all using the same templates. They're all using similar tools. They're all producing similar reports. So now when we learn a lesson on one project, it helps all of the projects because we're all singing from the same hymn book. We're all working in the same way. And in order to get from the level 1 of the foundation process to the silver process, basically we're adding in these attributes, 2 attributes at bronze and 2 more attributes for silver. Now it's at the silver level because we're doing things consistently and using an established way of doing it, and we're tailoring an established way rather than changing, we're tailoring to rules that enables us to keep the data comparable. So the processes for the software engineering are standardized and integrated in a standard process. So we don't get the odd, development manager or project manager saying, I'm going to use my own template. I'm going to do it my own way. I'm going to use the tools that I use in my last business. At Silver, it's an established way and everyone's learning together and marching on together. So all projects use an approved and adapted version of the standard software process. So the processes are used to let the software managers and the engineers to be more effective. And everyone gets training in the process. We're all doing it in a similar way, although we are allowed to tailor it to suit our needs. So what will this enable us to do? So as an example, here we've got like 10 projects, right? And if we just look at the requirements phase for a minute, if we look at the requirements phase, this is the number of reviews. So this is an agile project, say, and this is the number of demonstrations and workshops that were done during the early phases of the project. So project number 4 has had 8, and project number 7 has had 5. Project number 6 had none at all. There was an agile project, but they had no joint reviews, demos, or workshops during the early phase, let's say. If we turn the clock forward and we sort of say, well, how did these projects perform overall? And we know that projects 5 and 6 were ended up being problem projects, and so did project 9 ended up being a problem project. So in the lessons learned, we can analyze that data from those 10 projects, and we can draw a lower and an upper threshold. And we can sort of say most of the successful projects came in here, and the problem projects were the outliers. So let me just go back. So for instance, project 6 and project 5. Project 6 and project 5 are down here. And coincidentally, project 6 were problematic. And the idea is that if we were then to sort of look at the end of the sort of requirements phase, or 2 months into the project, whatever we thought was a stage of the project where we felt that maybe the requirements should be clear, now we're starting implementation, that here's some projects at that stage that we could zoom in on and say, what's wrong? Why are they not participating in the workshops? Why are they not attending the demos? And hopefully avoid the issues later when they're not happy with the results of the project. If I move on to a waterfall project, and now what we're doing is we're monitoring the change requests, right? So the number of change requests created during the requirements phase on these various projects. And again, project 6 and 7 had 0 and 1. And if we know from our experience of looking at 10 projects, we sort of say, well, look, most of the successful projects came in around here and we had some change requests. Now here's one that had none, but here's one that had what we would think were too many. And that could be a flag as well. That could be a red flag. And the idea is that because we're doing this review at the end of this requirements phase, it gives us a sort of an early warning signal to zoom in and ask questions, because we've got this historical data that says, look, if they're around here, they're probably okay. But if they're down here or up here, we should take a closer look and find out if there is something amiss. It could be that maybe, like this one, they don't really know what they want. There are too many change requests. Or this one down here, where we would expect some change requests and there aren't any at all. Now, so for this early warning system to work, if you remember, step 4 has to be the response plan. Now, in order to get a response plan, we need to think about how we're going to act on the data, how we're going to collect the data, how we're going to monitor it. Now, these sort of things already happen on most projects. You know, we have checkpoints, we have gate reviews, we have phase reviews, we'll have some dashboards, we'll have some scorecards. It's a case of adapting them to identify what are the warning signals that we want to see. An example might be most projects can survive quite happily if the project manager changes once. Now, if a project manager changes twice, maybe they can still be okay. But once a project manager starts changing 3 or 4 or 5 times, problems start happening. So one of the flags here could be, how many times has the project manager changed? And obviously when it gets to 3 or something like this, then that could be an early warning signal to sort of say, hey, we should do a review to check that you know, what is the reason that the project managers keep moving, or is it that the requirements are too challenging, or maybe the customer is too difficult to work with, or maybe the you know, these project managers see that they're heading for problems and they just don't know a way out, so they move on. But the idea is that we've got a warning signal that says, look, when this happens, it sometimes becomes a problem project. So as soon as we detect it happening, let's zoom in and look at it. Now, by doing it this way, what we're doing is we're shifting from over here where we are at, say, foundation, where the projects do finish, we do hit the dartboard, but there might be a lot of rework, to there's less rework because we're learning and we're getting these early warning signals. We're heading the problems off at the pass. We're getting involved early when we see things going off track. And after we've done this for a few years, we should be seeing something like this. Because the idea is this is a continual improvement program. And as we get better at using the data and identifying the warning signals and acting on those warning signals, we should start hitting the targets more often and getting more successful projects and having less problem projects. Now, no one has a crystal ball. You can't look into the future, but you can learn from experience and project it. So what we want to try and do is collect the performance data on projects based on similar projects. And in order to find similar projects, we've got to identify similar life cycles or certain types of projects. And we need to compare apples with apples. So we've sort of compared in projects of similar complexity, similar challenges. And then that should be able to help us do timely planning, effective resourcing, making sure the stakeholders are involved when they should be, managing the requirements, monitoring the cost of completion and managing risks. And if we do that consistently, and we can then look back at a project and create that data that enabled us to make the sort of graphs that I was sharing earlier. Now, if you do have a 9001 system or a quality management system, and it isn't using the Ticket Plus, or maybe even if it is using Ticket Plus, and you want to benefit from going up the levels and trying to implement the bronze and the silver process attributes, then there's lots of information available from this Ticket Plus website. There's one of the pages on the website is resources, and you can download a lot of information that will help you understand what's involved. Also, we're regularly running Ticket Plus training courses if you want to go down that route. And there is two types of training at the moment. There's the foundation training, there's also capability training, and the capability training tells you how to move from foundation to these capability levels, which are bronze and silver. So that's the presentation for today. So I'll open it up to questions now.